At 21 minutes past 5 in the morning on Thursday, the 23rd of July, people in Pampa, Texas, woke up to their houses making noises houses are not supposed to make. Several of them said the shaking went on for 20 seconds. One said 30. The epicenter was in northwestern Roberts County in the Texas Panhandle, about 24 miles northwest of the town of Miami, between Pampa and Spearman. Roberts County has a population of 827 people. Miami has under 600. This is cattle and wheat country, flat and quiet, and it is a very long way from anything a geologist would normally call a plate boundary. The United States Geological Survey put it at magnitude 5.0. Later listed by some agencies at 5.1 as the data were reviewed. Depth, about 3.5 miles, 5.5 kilometers. That is shallow. It was felt in Amarillo, in Lubbock, in Oklahoma City, in Tulsa. Reports came in from parts of New Mexico and southwestern Kansas. Hundreds of people filed felt reports with the USGS before breakfast. And there is a small discrepancy in those reports worth a moment, because it tells you something about how this is measured. The USGS shake map, the modeled map of how hard the ground moved, gave a maximum intensity of 6, described as strong. But a lot of the people filing reports through the Did You Feel It system describe shaking closer to 7. Those are two different scales doing two different jobs. Magnitude is one number for the whole earthquake, how much energy the rupture released. Intensity is a different number for every location, how hard it shook there. Intensity depends on distance, on the soil under your feet, on what floor you are standing on, and on whether you were asleep. A single earthquake has one magnitude and hundreds of intensities. When ShakeMap and the human reports disagree slightly, that is usually a sign the model has not fully captured the local ground conditions yet. And in a place with as few seismic stations as the Panhandle, that is exactly what you would expect. The USGS also issued an aftershock forecast, which is worth knowing because it is a genuine probability statement rather than a prediction. It said there would likely be smaller aftershocks over the following week, with up to 5 of them at magnitude 3 or higher, large enough to be felt nearby. Aftershock numbers decay over time, but a large aftershock can temporarily push the rate back up. And according to the USGS catalog, it is the strongest earthquake ever instrumentally recorded in the Texas Panhandle, and only the 4th of magnitude 4.0 or greater there since 1900. Now, that sentence has a trapdoor in it, and I am going to open it later, because the honest version of the record is stranger than the headline. But here is the thing I actually want to explain to you today. In the days after this earthquake, you would have read that scientists are investigating the cause, and you would have read 4 different explanations presented as 4 possibilities in a row, as though somebody will eventually announce which one won. That is not how this is going to resolve. And the reason why is the most interesting thing in this story. So the question is, what actually moved the ground under Roberts County? I will answer it properly, which means not yet. We need the rock first, then the record, then the water. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the numbers, the mechanism, and the stakes. Before we start, have you ever felt an earthquake somewhere that does not have earthquakes? Not California, not Japan. Somewhere it was not supposed to happen. Tell me in the comments where. Subscribe if you want the plain version of stories like this one. And a thumbs up helps this reach people. Let us go for 5,000. Now, let us get into it. Start with what is underneath. Beneath the Panhandle wheat, there is a structure called the Amarillo-Wichita Uplift. It is the buried remains of a failed rift, a place where, roughly 500 million years ago in the Cambrian, the continent began pulling itself apart and then stopped. I want to be precise about what a failed rift is, because it matters for everything that follows. When a continent starts to split, the crust stretches and thins, and it breaks along enormous faults running parallel to the tear. If the process finishes, you get an ocean basin. That is how the Atlantic was made. If it stops part way, the stretching ends, but the faults do not go anywhere. They stay in the rock. The crust heals over the top, sediment buries the whole thing, and after a few 100 million years, there is a wheat field on it. What is left underneath is a long scar of pre-existing weakness, a set of ready-made fractures in crust that is otherwise strong. Those faults do not do anything on their own, but they are the path of least resistance for any stress that finds them. The Amarillo-Wichita Uplift runs from north of Amarillo up into southwestern Oklahoma. And according to the National Weather Service office in Amarillo, most Panhandle earthquakes occur near the boundary between that uplift and the Anadarko Basin next to it. That is the ground. Now the record, and this is the trapdoor. The USGS catalog lists 3 earlier Panhandle earthquakes of magnitude 4 or greater. A 4.9 in Carson County on the 30th of July, 1925. A 4.5 north of Dalhart on the 12th of March, 1948. And a 4.5 northeast of Perryton on the 15th of February, 1974. But a separate historical compilation by the National Weather Service estimates that the 1925 event may have been a magnitude 5.4 and the 1948 event a 5.2, both larger than what happened last month. So which is it? Is this the strongest ever or the third strongest? Both, depending on what you mean by recorded. And the reason is not a dispute between scientists. It is that in 1925, there was no seismograph anywhere near Carson County, Texas. An earthquake's magnitude is calculated from ground motion measured by an instrument. If there was no instrument, you cannot calculate it. So what you do instead is work backwards from the damage. You collect reports, where people felt it, how strongly, what fell off shelves, whose plaster cracked. You map that pattern of intensity and you compare it against modern earthquakes whose magnitude you do know and you estimate. That is a legitimate method. It is called historical seismology, and it is how we know anything at all about earthquakes before about 1900. But the number it produces is a reconstruction from letters and newspaper clippings and cracked walls. And it carries uncertainty that an instrumental reading does not. So the honest sentence is, last month's earthquake is the largest ever measured by an instrument in the Texas Panhandle, and probably the third largest to have actually occurred there in the last century. That is not a media error. It is 2 different kinds of knowing, both real, sitting in the same table. And it matters more than a pedantic footnote, because it means the Panhandle's baseline, how often this place produces earthquakes this size naturally, is built on a thinner record than anyone would like. Right, now the water. The Panhandle is oil and gas country and has been for 100 years. When you produce oil, you also produce enormous volumes of salty wastewater, and the standard way to dispose of it is to inject it back underground through disposal wells. Here is the mechanism, and it is not the one most people picture. Injecting fluid underground does not blast rock apart. What it does is raise the pore pressure, the pressure of the fluid sitting in the spaces inside the rock. And pore pressure works against the weight pressing a fault shut. Think of a fault as 2 slabs held together by friction. The force holding them is the clamping pressure across the fault face. Push fluid into that fault, and the fluid pressure pushes the faces apart very slightly. The clamping force drops. The friction drops with it, and a fault that was holding against the stress it already carried can now slip. That is the whole thing. Injection does not create earthquakes out of nothing. It unclamps faults that were already there, already loaded, already waiting. Hold that sentence. It is going to matter shortly. Now, is this happening in the Panhandle? There is real research on it. A study published in the AAPG Bulletin in 2022 examined seismicity across the Texas Panhandle from 1983 to 2018. Its authors found that about 1.96 billion barrels of wastewater, 87% of the total injected, went into 7 geologic formations. One of those 7 was the Precambrian basement. That is the crystalline rock at the bottom, the old, hard, deep rock. The rock the failed rift faults are cut into. Injecting into the basement is the highest risk practice there is, because you are putting fluid directly into the formation that hosts the faults, rather than into a porous sedimentary layer above it that can absorb pressure. That study concluded that 61% of the earthquakes it examined showed minimal or stronger evidence of being induced by a combination of injection and oil and gas operations. And TexNet, the state seismic network run out of the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin, operates 8 stations in the Panhandle and has cataloged 13 earthquakes of potentially induced origin at magnitude 3.0 or above, including a magnitude 4.7 north of Amarillo in 2018. So there is a documented induced seismicity problem in the Panhandle. That is not in question. What is in question is this specific earthquake, and officials have been notably careful about it because a magnitude 5.0 is large for an injection-triggered event, and the evidence linking this one has not been assembled yet. Which brings me to how that assembly actually works, because scientists are investigating is doing a lot of concealing in that headline. There are 4 things they compare. Depth is the first and the strongest. Injection-triggered earthquakes tend to cluster at or just below the depth of the disposal zone, because that is where the pressure went. If an earthquake is far deeper than any well reaches, that is strong evidence against inducement. And the Railroad Commission's own operating guidelines say explicitly that they rely on TexNet scientists to determine whether an event has a deep focus and is therefore unlikely to be induced. Second, location. How close is the rupture to active injection in 3 dimensions? Third, timing. Did seismicity in this area rise after injection ramped up? And here is the complication that makes this slow. The lag between changing injection and seeing a change in seismicity can run 12 to 18 months. Pressure diffuses through rock at its own pace. Cause and effect are separated by a year. Fourth, the fault geometry. Was the fault that ruptured oriented in a way that the regional stress field would favor slipping, given a small nudge? When those 4 line up, you can build a confident case. When they do not, the honest position is to keep collecting data. And Texas has a real institutional mechanism for what happens when they do line up. The Railroad Commission can designate a seismic response area and curtail or suspend injection inside it. They have done it in the Permian Basin, at Gardendale, and in the northern Culberson-Reeves area, where operators agreed to cut collective disposal by about 68%. That is not a hypothetical power. It has been used. Now, there is one more thing that happened that day, and it caused some confusion online, so let me clear it up and then use it to make a point. At about 1:15 that same afternoon, a second earthquake hit Texas. Magnitude 3.9 near Westbrook, roughly 400 miles to the southwest of Roberts County. A number of people online assumed the two were connected, that the second was an aftershock of the first, or that something was moving across the state. They are not related. 400 miles is far beyond the distance over which one earthquake this size can meaningfully load another, and the two sit in entirely separate geological settings. Texas is a very large state with more than one seismic zone, and two unconnected earthquakes on one day is a coincidence of the calendar. But the location of that second one is instructive. Westbrook sits on the eastern edge of the Permian Basin, and the Permian is where induced seismicity in Texas is best documented and most actively regulated. It is where the Railroad Commission has designated seismic response areas and curtailed injection. If you want to see what the evidence looks like when it does line up cleanly, that is where to look. The Panhandle is a harder problem, and the next section is why. There is also a comparison in this story that got a lot of attention, and it deserves handling carefully. Geologists have noted that the Amarillo-Wichita Uplift is structurally similar to the Reelfoot Rift, another buried, failed rift, this one running under the point where Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky meet. That is the new Madrid seismic zone, and it produced the earthquake sequence of 1811 and 1812, among the most powerful in the recorded history of the continental United States, strong enough to be felt on the eastern seaboard. Nobody, and I mean nobody in the literature, is suggesting Texas is due for a new Madrid. The comparison being drawn is structural, not predictive. Two ancient failed rifts, same basic recipe, one under the Mississippi Valley and one under Panhandle wheat. What the comparison is genuinely useful for is this. It is the clearest evidence that a buried rift can produce large earthquakes with no oil industry anywhere near it. In 1811, there was no injection. There were barely any people. The faults did it on their own. So, we have the rock, the record, and the water. Let us answer the question. You will have seen this framed as four competing explanations: natural reactivation of the ancient rift, historical oil production, modern wastewater injection, or nobody knows. 4 doors, 1 prize. That framing is wrong, and here is why. Look again at the mechanism. Injection does not create faults. It cannot. What it does is reduce the clamping stress on faults that already exist, already carry tectonic load, and are already oriented to slip. Which means an ancient failed rift and wastewater injection are not rival answers. They are two halves of the same sentence. The rift is why there are faults down there to unclamp. The injection, if it is involved, is why one of them let go on the 23rd of July rather than in the year 2260. The Amarillo-Wichita Uplift supplies the fault and the accumulated stress. Injection into the Precambrian basement supplies the trigger. Neither is sufficient on its own. You cannot induce an earthquake in unfaulted rock, and a fault that is not sufficiently loaded will not slip no matter what you pump into it. So the real question is not whether it was natural or induced. It is, how much did we advance the clock? That is what scientists are investigating actually means, not sorting events into 2 bins, estimating a timing shift on a fault that was going to go eventually anyway. And that question is genuinely hard to answer for 3 reasons this story has already given you. The historical baseline is thin because half of it was reconstructed from newspaper clippings. The lag between injection and seismicity runs a year or more, which blurs cause and effect. And the causes are not exclusive, so there is no clean test that returns a yes or a no. Which is why the 4th explanation, nobody fully knows yet, is not a shrug. It is the accurate description of a problem where the answer is a proportion, not a verdict, and where getting that proportion right takes months of depth relocations, well records, and pressure modeling. I would rather tell you that than pretend a press release is coming. So what should you actually take from this? If you live in the Panhandle or anywhere in Texas or Oklahoma with disposal wells nearby, This is not a place with no earthquake risk. It is a place with low but real risk, and building stock never designed with any of it in mind. Securing a water heater and bolting a tall bookcase to a wall costs an afternoon. And a magnitude 5 at 3 miles depth is exactly the size that throws things off shelves without threatening a well-built house. If you felt this one, file a Did You Feel It report with the USGS. That is not busy work. Those reports are what builds the intensity maps, and intensity maps reconstructed from human reports are, as we have seen, the only record we have of the 1925 event. And when the analysis does come out, watch for the depth number and the well depths in the same paragraph. That is where the answer lives. The rift under the Panhandle has been there since before anything with a backbone walked on land. It has outlasted every ocean that has opened and closed since. It will still be there when the last disposal well is capped and forgotten. What changed on the 23rd of July was not the geology. It was, possibly, the schedule. Tell me in the comments where you were when you felt an earthquake nobody expected. Subscribe if you want the plain version of these. And thank you for giving me this much of your afternoon. I will see you next time.